Hello and welcome. My name is Julia Kupferman, and I am the J Street U Vice President of the Northeast region. I am thrilled to welcome our three amazing panelists today, Representative Pramila Jayapal of Washington's 7th District, Representative Alan Lowenthal of California's 47th, and Representative Khanna of California's 17th. Thank you all so much for joining us, and let's dive right into some questions we have for you. So to start, when the Netanyahu government threatened to make an official or de jure annexation of the West Bank last year, Democratic lawmakers made clear their overwhelming opposition to such a move. But annexation isn't the only serious threat to a two-state solution and to Palestinian rights. Each of you have led policy letters signed by dozens of your colleagues urging the U.S. government to oppose actions in the Palestinian territory that deepen the occupation and contribute to de facto or creeping annexation, such as demolitions of Palestinian homes. So why is it important for progressives, both inside and outside of Congress, to push back not only on de jure, but de facto annexation?
The de facto annexation is really setting the stage for de jure because the Israeli settlements are permanent, or they appear to be permanent. They have their own roads. The Palestinians do not have the same adequacy of getting around. The settlements surround the Palestinian villages. We spent some time in villages, and we saw that their electricity was cut off. It is almost as if the annexation is setting the stage for the Israelis to have a permanent annexation or de jure. It really challenged my belief, and especially one who grew up loving Israel and still does, understanding that the values that I think that Israel was created on, which was as a Jewish homeland and a democratic homeland, were threatened by the demolitions and the annexations that were taking place, and what it's like to be an occupying power. And I think they sabotage the ability to really create two separate but equal states, Israel and Palestine. And so these are critically important, and I think even though we look at them in terms of one was by law by Netanyahu, and the other one seemed to be created, there seems to be a plan towards the development of the settlements, really not to allow the Palestinian community to thrive and develop. And I think it's very dangerous. And I think that what we really need to do is to have policies that respect both sides, but to stand up and when the Israelis engage in behavior that really dehumanizes the Palestinians.
Happy to jump in and just add to what Representative Lowenthal said. I too remember my visit with J Street to Israel and the West Bank, and remember being at Khan al-Ahmar on the very day that bulldozers had arrived there, and talking to the village headman about all of the work that they had put into creating a school with recycled tires, and all of the kids who were going to be displaced from that village that they had actually been chased to in the first place. And so I think that the reality of seeing on the ground exactly what this creeping de facto annexation by Israel has led to and the further violations of Palestinian human rights, I think it not only violates Palestinian rights, but it threatens the emergence of a viable Palestinian state living alongside Israel. Those who believe in both Palestinian rights and Israel's future as a democratic home for the Jewish people have to speak out on this, because any long-term solution is threatened by this both de facto and de jure annexation. So I think, we have to demand that Israel end these acts immediately and move away from annexation and towards a two-state solution again, one that, frankly, a lot of people seeing Israel's actions are losing faith in. And I think that's why it is so important for us to speak out quickly and immediately. And that's why you've seen all of us, and as the chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, both Representative Khanna and Representative Lowenthal and all of our members of the Progressive Caucus have been very vocal on this topic.
I would just echo what Representative Lowenthal and Representative Jayapal have said. This is about two states. I mean, if you care about the U.S.-Israel relationship and Israel security and care about getting to any peace settlement, you're not going to get to that if you don't have a two-state solution. And to the extent that you have de jure or de facto annexation of the West Bank and a diminishment of Palestinian human rights, you're not going to set the conditions for peace talks or a two-state solution. This is actually pretty mainstream American policy. I would argue dating all the way back to President Clinton, the aspiration for two states. And so what we want to make sure is that that aspiration has a real chance.
Definitely. Thank you all for those very insightful answers. Let's go now to a slightly different question. So you and your colleagues have also asked the administration to look into whether U.S.-sourced military equipment was used in connection with activities like demolitions in Palestinian communities and forcible displacement of their residents. So why is U.S. aid an appropriate leverage point in pushing back on deepening annexation? Let's start with Representative Khanna first this time, and we can go backwards.
I think first it's important to understand the principles. People often say, are you singling out one nation? This is not about singling out any nation. This is about U.S. law. The U.S. has a law, the Leahy law, that none of our aid, none of our funding should be used in violation of human rights. And whether you are China or India or Great Britain or France or Israel or Japan, it doesn't matter. That's our policy. I would speak out if it was the United States using taxpayer money to violate human rights. And so what we believe is that if in aid that we're giving any country, and that includes Israel, that our resources, our taxpayer resources, should not be used in ways that are in contradiction to the Leahy law, that we should not be using our funding, our aid for equipment that could be contributing in any way to the violation of Palestinian human rights. Again, that seems to me such a reasonable take that's consistent with American law, and that I have tried to stand up for consistently in any part of the world.
I think that was beautifully articulated. I think there is no special relationship where U.S. funding should be used to further human rights abuses and violations of international law. We have a law right now that says that military equipment supplied to foreign governments can only be used for specified legitimate security purposes. So if another country, and as Representative Khanna said, any country is using our military resources to engage in human rights violations, like driving people from their land, then we need to step in and stop it as a co-equal branch of government, but also as people who just care about peace around the world. And the same goes for our military aid. I do not think that U.S. taxpayer dollars given for our allies' defense should be spent on equipment that is then used to implement creeping annexation. So we've been very clear about long urging the Israeli government to immediately reverse course, as we talked about, on de jure and de facto annexation efforts. And if the Israeli government continues those actions, then I think Congress really has no option but to quickly and forcefully respond with all options on the table, including the conditioning of military funding to Israel until the Israeli government abides by international law.
To me, the important issue is that American aid should advance American interests. That's really what we're doing. And creeping annexation and demolitions threaten the two-state solution that we've spoken about. They are not in America's interest. And I truly believe that demolitions and annexations threaten a secure Israel and also a democratic Israel. And so it is our interest to protect Israel and also to promote a Palestinian equal state. And we believe that the demolitions that are occurring violate international law, and we are complicit if we don't speak out and against that. And finally, what hasn't been said is that I've watched within Israel the right wing become stronger and stronger, and that's been going on now for quite some time, for decades. Even though the recent elections are very unclear, and it does not look like the Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to be able to form a government, right-wing parties have become the overwhelming majority. And I think it's really important as our ally that the United States sends a message to them that they cannot continue down a reckless path like this, that this is an inappropriate path for them to continue on. And I think that's one of the reasons we speak out, is to tell the government that the path that they're engaging in is reckless and we do not approve. And they are our allies and our friends.
Definitely. Thank you all for that. So what are some other tools that progressives both in and outside of Congress have to counter this deepening occupation and creeping annexation? Should we start with Representative Jayapal first this time?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think we just need to speak out. There's really no question that Donald Trump deeply harmed the United States' ability to play a constructive diplomatic role, including with his sham deal of the century that paved the way for this very annexation that we're discussing today. And I use that as an example because members of Congress, including those of us here, stood up and rebuked him while rejecting the Israeli government's illegal annexation of Palestinian territory. But we've also been proactive. We've passed resolutions that reaffirm Congress's support for a two-state solution that results in a Palestinian state coexisting with Israel. We also went further to, really for the first time in history, condemn Israel's settlement expansion because it is critical that our foreign policy lives up to our values. And then additionally, we talked about the country's bloated $740 billion Pentagon budget. I've long worked to cut defense spending and helping push forward efforts to slash Pentagon funding. These cuts are also about our values, and they're about restoring peace and diplomacy around the world, including in the Middle East. And it's a key priority of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. And then maybe the last thing to say is we just need to increase transparency and take steps to make sure that our aid isn't being used in a manner that goes against our values and interests, and make a sharper distinction in law and policy between how we think about Israel, how we regard Israel, and how we regard the settlements in occupied Palestinian territory.
I'll come jumping in again just to add on those wonderful comments. I think we shouldn't be afraid to criticize settlement activity. We should be honest and open about it. We need to re-engage with the Palestinians to make sure that their voice has been heard. I think the Biden administration has taken a tremendous first step, positive step, by resuming aid to UNRWA, which is the United Nations Refugee and Work Agency. We need to show the costs to both the Israelis and the Palestinians about their own suffering on both sides and insecurity that an occupation leads to. And we have to elevate the issue here in the United States. Right now, there's where our foreign policy seems to be more focused, and I'm not objecting to it, but has been focused on both issues in Iran and also with China. And the administration is not focused as much on what is taking the Middle Eastern conflict. And I think that it's really important that we elevate that conversation. And also, I think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict needs to be elevated because it's still a great source of tension. I worry about the future of the Israeli democracy, which I am a great supporter of. And as a Jewish American, it creates a moral dilemma within me without dealing with this issue. And I think it's for all those reasons, it's really important that we engage in all of these tools.
Well, Representative Lowenthal, of course, has been a leader. His resolution on 2 states surpassed overwhelmingly the House of Representatives. So it shows, I think, where sentiment is in the Congress. And I think we have to continue, in my view, to win over the hearts and minds of the American public and the global public, and the view that one can be pro-Israel and believe that you care deeply about the U.S.-Israel relationship, and at the same time believe that what is going to make Israel safe, what is going to keep Israel a Jewish state, and what is going to be a just solution requires a commitment to 2 states, and it requires an end to more settlements, and it requires a recognition of the human rights of Palestinians. This used to be, as I understood it, Shimon Peres's view and the view of many people on the left of Israel politics. And the fact that the world has now seen in the United States, of course, with Trump, and in other parts of the world, the rise of a right-wing, inward-looking nationalism, it does not mean that ideology should define any nation's conception of their self-interest, much like it did not define America's conception of our self-interest. And I would have welcomed people criticizing Donald Trump from when he acted in contradiction to American principles. I wouldn't take offense at that as an American. Similarly, I think what some of us are saying is those who care about the Israel-U.S. relationship, that there is a way to do this that grounds it in a commitment to human rights and long-term security, and we have to win that argument.
Definitely. Thank you all. I have one final question to ask you. So what final piece of advice do you have for our activists on how to help leaders in Congress like yourselves push the envelope on this issue? Let's start with Representative Lowenthal.
Don't lose hope. The road to peace is long, and the possibilities may seem remote, but this work that you're doing, that we're all doing, is absolutely critical. So hang in there. We're doing what is really important.
Well, mine is organize, don't agonize. I come to Congress as a 20-year organizer, community organizer, and I just want to give a special shout out to the J Street U and young folks across the country who I think have really changed the conversation. And that is so incredibly important. Run a campaign, be relentless, speak out your truth and your values, and get more people involved. That is what ultimately changes the boundaries of what is seen as possible.
I would just say that personal stories and storytelling has a big impact. I was very moved by Nathan Thrall's recent piece where he talked about a Palestinian father who loses his son and who is on a search to find his son that was on a bus that was blown up. And I circulated that piece to some of my colleagues in the Progressive Caucus. And at the end of the day, things that speak to human stories, that highlight suffering, I think invoke the conscience of people, because ultimately anyone who serves is a human being. And I think the more that those stories are told, on all sides, that helps us get to a more just outcome.
Definitely. Well, thank you all so much for your insightful answers and for your leadership on our issue. We really appreciate you, and we really appreciate having you here at our conference.